to the Game Before the Money podcast, celebrating pro and college football history. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Game Before the Money podcast. I'm Jackson Michael, and with me today is author John Eisenberg. John and I first met at the Texas Book Festival several years ago. He was promoting his book, 10-Gallon War, which is about the Dallas Texans and the Dallas Cowboys trying to get fans to come to their games in the early 1960s. The Dallas Texans ended up moving to Kansas City, and they are now the Kansas City Chiefs. That's a great book, 10-Gallon War, that John Eisenberg wrote several years ago. He's got a new book. It's called Rocket Men, the Black Quarterbacks Who Revolutionized Pro Football. And in this interview, we're going to celebrate the careers of players like Warren Moon, James Harris, Doug Williams, and talk a little bit also about Eldridge Dickey, great quarterback in college at Tennessee State. Had a great Texas high school football career as well, nicknamed the Lord's Prayer. John Eisenberg, many great books. I recommend that if you haven't read his work, that you do so. I think the first book of his that I read was called That First Season, which was about Vince Lombardi's first season with the Green Bay Packers in 1959. That's an excellent book. He wrote Cotton Bowl Days, about the Dallas Cowboys playing in the Cotton Bowl in the years before Texas Stadium. He's also got a book called The League, focusing on some of the early owners of the National Football League. John Eisenberg, great sports fan, great sports writer, great student of the history of the game, and I think you'll really enjoy this interview with him. Don't forget to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com. Please remember that the Game Before the Money is a nonprofit organization, 501c3, and I'm always appreciative of the donations people send via PayPal. You can donate on thegamebeforethemoney.com. And without further ado, here's a great interview, great chat with writer John Eisenberg about his book, Rocket Men, the Black Quarterbacks Who Revolutionized Pro Football. The first question I'm going to ask is probably the most common question, but your new book, Rocket Men, the Black Quarterbacks Who Revolutionized Pro Football, what inspired you to write it?
Well, it's my 11th book, and I've done the prior ones include a lot of sports history, football, baseball, and horse racing, and I also wrote sports columns in newspapers and websites for 40 years. And there was always a thread of race running through a lot of what I did. You know, that is something that always interested me. If you, like for years when I wrote columns in Baltimore Sun, I would sometimes write about black athletes, obviously. And I remember at the Winter Olympics once writing about a figure skater, Debbie Thomas, a black figure skater who won a bronze medal. And I wrote some columns, and I came home from the Olympics and gotten all this awful mail, which doesn't bear repeating. And it just kind of shocked me. And certainly if you are in a public-facing job and you deal with that for many years, it gets your attention. And so the black quarterback story is one that I felt would be good to shine a light on exactly what happened here, because I'm in Baltimore where Lamar Jackson landed about 5 years ago, now 6, and certainly when he was coming out of college, he dealt with a lot of the old sort of prejudices. He should be a running back. He should be a wide receiver. Was he smart enough? All this stuff that a lot of black quarterbacks dealt with. And so I've had it up close here for a few years, and you just added all that up. I thought, well, this is a great story. I think it's important for people to know what happened over time at the position with black quarterbacks, and just tell the story and make sure that people are aware how popular football is, but let's be clear about what happened at this position.
That's a great thing to do. I mean, there's so much history there. You mentioned at the quarterback position, there was also middle linebacker, there was also center, there was also for a time, free safety. Those were considered the quote-unquote thinking positions, and blacks were not generally allowed to play those positions.
That's exactly right. The thinking positions. It was just a straight white power structure in the NFL. Certainly, you go to the 50s, 60s, the 70s. All the owners, all the coaches, all the general managers, all the decision makers. And so they had all the power, and it was the sort of prejudices coming out of the 50s or 40s was a black person smart enough to run an offense, call the signals? Did they have enough discipline? Would they work hard? Would they come through in the clutch? Would teammates look up to them? Just all sorts of stuff. And so at the quarterback position, this was really without any basis because there were no black quarterbacks. But it was also true at middle linebacker, as you said, safety, anywhere where signals were called or where thinking was necessitated or thought to be necessitated. So it was a pretty searing state of affairs and very difficult on generations of black athletes.
And I think it's important to just point out that this wasn't just an NFL kind of thought paradigm. This was a fair part of society as a whole.
Absolutely. This mirrored society. What we're really talking about here is black leadership, just the whole notion of it. And it was also true in the law, in business. I think the first black CEO of a Fortune 500 company was in like 1987. The first Joint Chiefs of Staff in the military, which of course was segregated through World War II, not until after Harry Truman had to sign an executive order to integrate the military. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, was black. 1989, I think, the first black Joint Chiefs of Staff. So they're just across society, really. This is just another example of long-standing white institutions grudgingly acknowledging that black leadership was something that it would entertain and then finally accept as legitimate.
Now, asking who was the first pro football black quarterback is kind of like asking who invented rock and roll. I've always kind of thought it was George Taliaferro, but then of course there's Willie Thrower, there's Kenny Washington, Choo Choo Charlie Bracken's also in there, and you even dug back and found some single wing tailbacks who might even qualify.
Yes, well, Joe Lillard, if you go back into the 30s, Joe Lillard, right before the NFL went all white in 1934, Joe Lillard was a single wing tailback that could throw, could run, but he had a real rough time on and off the field, really in an era where the NFL just was not accepting of black players for the most part, and so he was out of the pros. But yes, there's just a whole bunch of them. I mean, the whole notion of a quarterback. I mean, the first black starting quarterback. I mean, Fritz Pollard started a game in 1923. I found the box score. He was the quarterback. And as I say in the book, it's sort of an asterisk because it was the single wing, and this was the old school single wing where everything ran through the tailback. The quarterback was a minor position, and so it did a lot of blocking. And it was not that important. It was only when you started to see the modern offenses and the modern style quarterback in the 30s that once the NFL opened up to passing in 1933, that's when the quarterback position began to change. And actually, I detail all this in the book, and it has a lot to do with the racial composition of quarterbacks over the years. But yeah, it's not easy to say. I mean, Fritz Pollard, it's in a box score, so it happened. But then those single wing guys, and then the guys that you mentioned in the 50s, Willie Thrower and different fellas, they got a couple of snaps. The first starter was Marlon Briscoe in 1968. That's modern. So, but George Taliaferro certainly was, but he was like a wildcat quarterback, but nonetheless a quarterback. So it's all over the map. It has to do with changing strategy in football. The point is made, but the details you can debate.
Stating that Marlon Briscoe is the first starter, even all that I know about football, I hadn't realized that Marlon Briscoe was the first starter, and that was in '68, I believe.
Right, that's correct. First modern black starting quarterback. He was with the Denver Broncos. He was a rookie. He had been a really good college quarterback at the University of Omaha, they called it then. Small school. He was really good, shifty runner, strong passer, great leader, set all sorts of records. The Broncos drafted him this is absolutely what happened to every good black quarterback back then, drafted him and said, you'll be a defensive back. And he said, well, he negotiated with them. 3 days in training camp. Can I show you what I can do at quarterback? And they grudgingly said yes. So he did a real nice job in those 3 days. But nonetheless, they put him back at defensive back. But what happened is the season started. The Broncos were not very good that year. And all the quarterbacks, all the white quarterbacks got injured. So they had no choice. They put him in the game. And it was a seminal moment. And he started playing. And he came in as a sub in a couple games, and then he started, and he did very well. Had a nice touchdown to interception ratio, ran up a lot of offensive yardage. I mean, the Broncos didn't win all the games, but it was very clear that it's certainly the caliber of AFL football then, which was good. Marlon Briscoe was quite capable of being a quarterback. And so he ended the season with 5 starts and good stats, and the Broncos rewarded him by basically saying, you'll never do that again. You will never be quarterback. And he had to change teams and change positions to keep his career going. He went to the Bills as a receiver. And then he went on to the Miami Dolphins, was on that undefeated championship team as a wide receiver. So he's known more for that, but he could have been a really nice quarterback for a long time. Pretty clear in pro football.
Yeah, and around that time, in the late 60s, you kind of start to see some evolution. You had Eldridge Dickey drafted in the first round by the Raiders out of Tennessee State, ostensibly drafted as a quarterback. Now, like you said, they moved him to wide receiver, but the thinking at first, at least, was to give him an attempt at quarterback.
Yeah, in the first round, just blew the minds of a lot of people in pro football that they did that. Pro football was so different then. It's almost apples and oranges, because a round later, they drafted Kenny Stabler. They drafted another quarterback. And they already had Darryl LaMonica, who was the MVP of the league the year before. So in the salary cap era, started in the 90s, no team would ever do that. You number one, you can't stack all those players at one position. You would never start a draft with 2 quarterbacks who weren't going to play. Crazy stuff in hindsight. And certainly the Raiders were thinking, yes. I mean, it's to their credit that they drafted him, and Al Davis said all the right things in the aftermath. We don't care whether he's polka dot in terms of his race. And they hoped he would be an all-time star, because he was another player who just had amazing electric talent, and anyone could see it. But he did get shifted to receiver, turned out right away. There were too many good quarterbacks there, and he got discouraged, and they found things they didn't like about him. It was amazing, and part of the story of the evolution of the black quarterback is the style of football that was played in the pros for so long, in which the quarterback was asked to drop straight into the pocket, don't move around. It was held against you if you scrambled. The offensive linemen didn't like it, the coaches didn't like it, and in Eldridge Dickey's case, it was held against him that he could run like the wind, and if a play broke down, even if he did well, they didn't want it. And so he wound up just never taking a snap in pro football in a regular season game as a quarterback. Marlon Briscoe's line was, he's the best quarterback we never saw.
Yeah, that's a great line. And yeah, I have seen a little bit of footage of Eldridge Dickey in college, and they use that moving pocket at Tennessee State, kind of like what you would see nowadays in the NFL. He was mobile, and the irony was he came around late 60s. That's just before guys like Fran Tarkenton and Kenny Stabler made that kind of improvisation at quarterback, something, and Roger Staubach too, something that became, a thing of beauty and a weapon.
Yes, very much so, and his timing was just off that way. And but his college coach, John Merritt, is certainly a legendary black college football coach. And when I was researching this book, I just was going through the newspaper files, and some of his comments were amazing. What he could, it's almost like he saw the future. He said, one of these days, and I hope it's with Eldridge, but there's going to be a quarterback who can run, and it's going to turn the NFL upside down. And I said, boy, now those are prescient words, I mean, that is what happened. But it happened about 45 years after Eldridge Dickey, unfortunately for Eldridge. But some people could see the future, but the sport was not ready for it on a general basis at that point.
And it's important to point out that just like society, there were people within the NFL, within the power structure and decision makers, who were willing to give anybody an opportunity. And just like in society, you had that too. We're talking about prevailing stereotypes here. But you got to chat with Upton Bell, who is a good friend of this program, good friend of mine, and listeners are very familiar with Upton. And Upton was out scouting players, anybody. He was looking to get anybody he could get for the Colts. And you spoke with him for the book. What did you glean from Upton?
Well, as always, Upton, fascinating, and boots on the ground recollections are amazing. And yes, he was scouting for the Baltimore Colts in the mid '60s, just getting into football, and he's 20-something years old. As he said, every other scout was 60, and he heard those long-held prejudices routinely. He'd be somewhere and they'd say, "Oh, look at that quarterback. Oh, he'll be a good receiver, a good running back, or whatever." And Upton, being younger, more of that generation of the '60s, was like, "Well, that's ridiculous. He's a good quarterback. Why can't he play quarterback?" And so he not only heard the old school thinking, he then tried to do something about it. He ultimately was scouting director for the Colts and then general manager of the Patriots. And he was ready he drafted a black quarterback in the third round of the Baltimore Colts when they had Johnny Unitas. Carl Douglas was his name, and he didn't have. Upton still feels guilty about it because he was not there to lobby for him as a roster spot after having drafted him, because he'd changed jobs. And so he was very much in the corner of these young black guys that are playing quarterback in college. They could play in the pros if given an opportunity. He firmly believed it then, and he's another one years ahead of his time. So yeah, there were guys like that were great, and coaches as well. Chuck Knox is a coach that some people, historians, were. He was a good football coach in the '70s, and he's the one that put James Harris on the field as the starting quarterback for the LA Rams in 1974, when really no other coach in the history of football to that point had said, "I'm going to put a black quarterback under center as my starter." So Chuck Knox is definitely another. And you can go through it, guys that were willing to buck the system and give opportunities, because that's what it took for that door to open at all.
And yeah, bringing us to James Harris, Grambling quarterback, counseled under Eddie Robinson, was an underclassman, I think, at the time when Eldridge Dickey was coming up at Tennessee State, growing up in Monroe, Louisiana, I believe.
Right.
And,
right.
So he grew up around Grambling, and then he gets coached by Eddie Robinson. And Eddie also, I guess, from what we've gleaned from an interview with James Harris for the HBCU oral history that we're putting together, Coach Robinson had a talk with Howard Cosell. And Howard Cosell said, I think within a few years, America will be ready to see somebody. Can you produce a quarterback? And he came back and chatted with James Harris. What can you tell us about James Harris and his trajectory? Because he's got a great story, too.
He has an amazing story. And Howard Cosell, by the way, he needled Eddie Robinson on national television. He said, Eddie, you've produced players at every position. Why can't you produce a quarterback? And Eddie Robinson just, I think it got under his skin a little bit. And so, it's a classic Howard Cosell story. The way James tells the story is that Eddie Robinson flew back from New York. He'd filmed the interview straight to James's house and said, "You're going to be it. I'm going to groom you. You're 6'4", 210 pounds, big arm. You're it. You're going to be the first pro. Howard Cosell has given me trouble here, and you're going to be the one that is going to shut him up." And so he did. He did groom James Harris. James, I interviewed for the book, is just an unbelievable interview, and such a tale to tell coming out of the South, drafted by the Buffalo Bills in 1969 in the 8th round, when he certainly had talent to go a lot higher. He went after a number of white quarterbacks who never sniffed a roster, but that was par for the course then. So he goes to Buffalo. That part of his story is as amazing as anything. As a rookie, it's the year O.J. Simpson is there. And they put up O.J. at the Hilton, and they put up James Harris at the Y. This is for a rookie camp. For $6 a night, he's staying at the Y.
Wow.
And he does not have any money. I mean, he flew up there. He didn't. His football, again, was so different. He didn't have an agent. Eddie Robinson negotiated his contract. And of course, the Bills lowballed him. And he went to the team and said, look, while this contract gets done, I need a little bit of money. And like, if I want to get a sandwich or something. And they said, okay. And they gave him a job cleaning his teammates' cleats in the locker room. So
that is unbelievable.
It's an amazing story. And so what's really amazing about it is then training camp starts and he wins the job through training camp in the preseason. And they had Jack Kemp. He's the starting quarterback on opening day for the Buffalo Bills. I mean, his talent came through after having cleaned the cleats several months earlier. So he didn't keep the job for long. He was benched by halftime in the first game, and they never really played him much ever again. But that summer is just unbelievable.
Wow, and I don't think that too many people realize that both James Harris and O.J. Simpson both played in the AFL.
That is a very interesting point of the whole thing. These are not NFL teams. That is Marlon Briscoe, AFL. James Harris, AFL. And so really the NFL teams were slow on the draw. It wasn't until the 70s. Really wasn't until the 70s for the NFL, with James Harris being the first starter and first one to get any sort of chance. That was 1974. He goes to the Rams. He was out of football for a year after the Bills cut him. And there was no interest really in him. And finally, Eddie Robinson got him a position on the taxi squad of the Rams because he knew Tank Younger. Tank Younger had played at Grambling in the 40s and 50s, and he was one of the first black players in the NFL after World War II, and he was now a scout for the Rams. He was a Grambling product, and so Eddie Robinson prevailed on Tank to get James Harris onto the taxi squad. And so from that point, he winds up winning the job eventually, and he played for 2 years. They were in the NFC Championship game twice. They barely lost one of them. He was like one weird play away from taking the Rams to the Super Bowl in 1974, which would have changed the narrative drastically. But there was a weird penalty down on the goal line, and the Rams wound up losing to the Minnesota Vikings. So he almost went to the Super Bowl. So it would have been quite a story there.
Wow. The weird twists and turns of NFL history. And that's quite an example there. Now, when we get to the late 70s, that's when I was, I'm not quite old enough to remember the 74 season, but I do start remembering 76, was the first Super Bowl I remember, Super Bowl 11. And I grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin around the Packers market. Now, by the time I really started watching football of 77, 78, Vince Evans is the starting quarterback for the Bears, and Doug Williams is the starting quarterback for the Buccaneers. So for us in the Midwest, we had half the division as black starting quarterbacks. But over the years, I realized that those were the only two black starting quarterbacks in the league at the time. So it's interesting that they were Doug Williams and Vince Evans both in the same division.
Yes, and they played each other. There's a game in 1979, late September game, where they started against each other. That was a first. Two black quarterbacks starting against each other in the NFL. I'm not sure it happened again for a while. It might have been close to 20 years. I mean, I don't have that in front of me. But yes, they were. And, Doug Williams certainly had been drafted in the first round, and the Bucs were invested in him, and he took them. They were the worst team in the league by far when he was drafted, and he was there for 5 years. They were in 3 times in the playoffs, 1 time in the NFC Championship game, and he was ready to sail on into the future with the Bucs. But Hugh Culverhouse, the owner, played hardball with him, and he wound up not signing with them and was so disgusted that he was out of football for a year, and then he was in the USFL. And so Vince Evans also went to the USFL. And so that's when Warren Moon comes to the NFL from Canada in 1984. He is the only black starting quarterback. Vince Evans and Doug Williams are gone. They are not in the NFL. And so really it starts from scratch again. Unbelievably, in the 64th year of the NFL, they're starting from scratch with black starting quarterbacks with Warren Moon with the Houston Oilers.
Wow. And Warren Moon, such an incredible story in himself. And I've been blessed to be able to chat with Warren for the Texas Sports Hall of Fame podcast and get to chat with him at length. And as well as Lee Steinberg a little bit about his situation. Now, he's coming out of college in 78. Now, I always make this point. Same year Earl Campbell came out. Coming out of college in 1978. And Warren's and Lee Steinberg, who's his agent, they're pretty much being told that Warren, despite winning the Rose Bowl and being MVP of the Rose Bowl, he's not seen as a quarterback.
Right. It's just the classic tale that had happened to good black quarterbacks, not all of them, but almost all of them, to that point, 1978. We don't want you at quarterback. You be a good running back. You be a good receiver. I think they wanted Warren to be a running back. So he had told them, he had sent letters, I think, or at least Steinberg had told the teams when they called, said he's not changing position. So, you make the choice there. He's going to be a quarterback. So he goes undrafted. He just went on. It was like, okay, well, here's where we think of you. And he goes undrafted and winds up playing in Canada. Went to the Canadian League, and I detail in my book. That's where a lot of the real college stars, black quarterback college stars, was to Canada. There were really major stars. Condridge Holloway at Tennessee, the first black quarterback in the SEC. A great talent. If he was playing today, Condridge Holloway, with the RPOs and the way the offenses, the quarterback moves around, he would have been devastating. But back then, he went to Canada. So Warren, a few years later, does the same thing and wins the Grey Cup 5 years out of 6. He's just completely dominant in the league, and from the get-go as a professional, he's everything that we would see from Warren for the 15 years he was in the NFL, which was cool in the pocket, big arm, mobile, able to make all the throws, under pressure, cool, just an elite quarterback, period. And so he wins titles in Canada, comes to Houston, and signs there, and he's in the league for the next 16 years as an elite quarterback. And I don't think anyone changed the narrative, did more to change the narrative. Doug Williams winning the Super Bowl certainly was the seminal moment in 1988, but Warren Moon was really the one that changed a lot of minds on black quarterbacks just by being such a class elite quarterback for as long as he was.
Threw probably still to this day, threw the most beautiful ball that I've seen. I mean, just a beautiful spiral, had just a perfect arc to it. Yep. Just a tremendous passer. And the one thing I always love to bring up, and I alluded to it before, but I think one really important thing to remember about Warren Moon is when he came into the league in 1984, even though he had graduated in the same class as Earl Campbell, who had a Hall of Fame career, Earl Campbell only had 2 years left in his Hall of Fame career. Earl Campbell only played 2 more years after Warren came in to the NFL. And Warren ended up being, when Warren retired, he had the 3rd most passing yards in NFL history behind Dan Marino and John Elway. So it's like you add in another 6 years, and 2 of those years in Canada, he probably wouldn't have posted him in the NFL, but 2 of those years he threw for 5,000 yards in the Canadian League. So you add some of those numbers in, you're talking at that point, he may have come close to Marino's record, if not topped it by the end of his career.
Yes, basically from a statistical standpoint, 6 of potentially his best years were taken away. His NFL statistical standpoint, I'm saying. 6 of his best years, ages 21 through 27. So that's gone. I mean, what did Marino do in those years? A lot. So,
he sure did.
So Warren, yes, could easily be the all-time guy, all-time leader in that. And he did throw for, I think, over 70,000 yards as a pro. I don't know that anyone has topped that if you add Canada into it. So just an amazing figure in this story, and a keeper of the flame, I might add, to this day. Still, I interviewed him, as you have. I've interviewed him at length for this book, and he is still ready when he ever sees anything that he feels like is a vestige of the old school thinking. He's the first one to point it out and find a camera or somebody to talk to and get a headline on it. He will gladly do that. This is what was going on 50 years ago. Can't believe it's still going on. So he will always do that.
Yeah, and it's hard to believe. Warren had trouble finding a scholarship. He had to play JUCO to even get a scholarship to play quarterback. And as he said, he was going to quit football if he couldn't play quarterback.
Yep, law school. He's going to go to law school. So that's I don't know how close he came, but that was his plan.
Now, the one other guy I'd like to talk about that I think is really important to bring up is Randall Cunningham, because he came in, I think he was playing during Warren Moon's career, probably late 80s, if I remember right, late 80s, early 90s, Randall Cunningham. For those of us who remember Randall Cunningham coming in, he was incredible. He looked like a Hall of Famer, by his 3rd or 4th year, and then he suffered that injury. But what can you tell us about Randall Cunningham, and where does he fit into this narrative?
Well, I sort of, from a narrative standpoint, see Warren Moon, Randall Cunningham, Doug Williams as sort of a generation. It's the first generation of guys that really got on the field and accomplished things and started to change minds. And Warren, we've talked about. Doug Williams, he did it by winning a Super Bowl as a starting quarterback. Randall's part of it is, as you said, he came into the league a year after Warren. He was drafted in the 2nd round, so it showed you things were changing a little bit. And the Eagles took him a year or two to sort of figure out what to do with him, but Buddy Ryan was in place as the head coach. And Buddy was a defensive coach, and his idea was, we're going to have a great defense, and we're just going to let Randall do whatever he can do. Do your thing on offense. We'll give you the ball. So what's really important about that was, as I said before, the prototype was a straight drop back, white quarterback, don't move around. Randall clearly had unbelievable speed and elusiveness, and as well as a great throwing arm, and was most effective sometimes throwing on the run. So the Eagles let him do that. They let Randall be Randall and didn't try to change him. And there was an example of another example of someone willing to stick their neck out a little bit, Buddy Ryan in that case. And they were rewarded for it. I mean, they didn't get to a Super Bowl with Randall, but he was an amazing talent who just ran and threw and was a playmaker. And the NFL had never really seen a quarterback like that. And went to Pro Bowls, and they went to the playoffs, and just a playmaker. It just changed it's just changed what a fan watching could expect from a quarterback position when you saw him running around doing what he did. And so, his contributions, and again, he played a long time. And 10 years, I think, in Philadelphia, and then he bounced around a little. He was with the Vikings, had a great year with the Vikings as an older quarterback. And so he's another one. Those three really together just changed so many minds and were the first ones to open the door.
Yeah, and Randall Cunningham, when he came into the league, like you said, nobody had seen anybody like Randall Cunningham. And he just had to, it's one of those things. You had to be there because,
Yep.
He didn't, he had 2 knee injuries, I think. He had one that knocked him out for, I think it might have been the first or second game of the year against the Packers. And
early, like his 5th year or something like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that really interrupted his career. And then I think he had another serious injury later, but he's one of those guys that, he kind of falls into the Billy Sims category. Like, if he hadn't had like that devastating injury, we'd be talking about Randall Cunningham all day.
I got several pages in my book on there's one touchdown in particular. It was on Monday Night Football. They were playing the Giants, and they're in the red zone. They're on like the 5-yard line. He rolls right, and Carl Banks just levels him, and knocks him horizontal to the field. And he maintains it, puts his hand down, maintains his balance, keeps rolling right, takes another hit. But as he's taking the hit, he throws a touchdown pass. And talk about one of those moments where you had to be there. No one had ever seen that really from a quarterback. And what was it? The first 50 years of Monday Night Football, they did the top 100 plays. That play was on it. Just a little touchdown pass. But if you see it, you'll go, how in the world did that happen? A guy just absorb just a leveling hit, remain upright, throw a touchdown pass. Every pro football went crazy when they saw that play.
Yeah. Well, John, it's been great chatting with you, and I really love having you on the program. I hope everybody checks out Rocket Men, the black quarterbacks who revolutionized pro football. Again, just another great book that you've put out. Just great research, great writing. Is there anything else important that you think you'd like to add?
Well, I do carry on the narrative into the current century, the current era. I love talking about the guys we did. They're so important. They are the pioneers. And I bring it into the current era with Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, and how football has changed really in the last, I'd say, 12, 13 years, and what quarterbacks. We're seeing so many more black quarterbacks now. It's changed dramatically. I think 14 of the 32 teams the first weekend of this NFL season, they started black quarterbacks. So that is a dramatic change. I think it's a permanent change. I mean, we're going in the right direction. These teams no longer seeing color certainly at the position. So I detail a lot of that, and the generation that really changed it, I think, was the generation of Cam Newton and Colin Kaepernick and Russell Wilson came into the league, and that was the moment when the NFL said, we really, finally and forever, are not going to ask you to be a drop back quarterback. Look at what they were rocket men. They could run, they could throw, and the NFL teams changed their offenses to suit their talents instead of the other way around. Instead of taking this talented guys and saying, you have to fit our system, they changed the offenses. And so now 12 years later, you're seeing almost every NFL offense with the run pass option and quarterbacks. There's a lot of unpredictability, and it has. You can still be a drop back quarterback, but there are many other ways to do it now at that position, and so it's just changed the game fundamentally. And it's fascinating stuff, and it's all in there. And I appreciate coming on with you and having the chance to talk about it.
All right, John. Well, I'd love to have you on again and just sit down and chat NFL history. I've really loved a lot of your books, 10 Gallon War, that first season, and we're both, football history geeks. It'd be great just to chat and talk shop together.
Be great. I would love it. Lots of fun. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Game Before the Money podcast. Remember to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com for great football history articles. Transcriptions of some episodes are available at thegamebeforethemoney.com and are powered by our transcription partner Sonix, spelled Sonix. Visit sonix.ai to learn more about their transcription services.